Leona Dawson was just another temporary nurse at Valora Medical Institute, going about her morning rounds like any other day. When she first noticed the yellow stains on an elderly black woman's hospital gown and the sharp, acrid smell that filled the room, it seemed like a simple accident, the kind that happens all too often in busy hospitals. But as she helped the frightened patient change her soiled clothes, something about Clara Reynolds's trembling hands and downcast eyes told a different story. What Leona would uncover in the following hours would shake her faith in the medical profession to its core. Before we dive into this shocking story that will make you think twice about who's really treating patients in our hospitals, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Leona Dawson took a deep breath as she stood outside the imposing facade of Valora Medical Institute. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and a cool breeze rustled through her neatly tied brown hair. At 25 years old, Leona was still relatively new to nursing, and the prospect of working another shift at this large, bustling hospital made her stomach churn with nervous anticipation. She had been called in to help on what was sure to be a hectic Friday. Though she had worked a few shifts here before, Valora wasn't her usual hospital. The sheer scale of the place and the constant flow of patients still felt overwhelming. But Leona was determined to rise to the challenge and perform her duties with professionalism and care. As she pushed through the main entrance, Leona was immediately swept up in the controlled chaos of the hospital. Doctors and nurses rushed past, their shoes squeaking on the polished floors. The air was thick with the sharp scent of disinfectant, punctuated by beeping monitors and the low murmur of voices. Leona made her way to the locker room, weaving through the crowded corridors with practiced ease. Once inside, she changed into her red nursing uniform, smoothing out any wrinkles before tying her hair back into a simple, professional bun. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, taking another steadying breath. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "They need your help, and you're good at what you do." As she left the locker room, Leona's mind drifted to her previous shifts at Valora. While she was confident in her nursing skills, the fast-paced environment here still left her feeling slightly off balance. The constant influx of patients, the rapid-fire decisions, the need to be alert and ready for anything at a moment's notice. It was exhilarating, but also exhausting. Shaking off her doubts, Leona reminded herself that she was here to help. Her professionalism and dedication would see her through no matter how hectic things got. She squared her shoulders and headed to the nurse's station to check her assignment for the day. The head nurse handed Leona a patient file. "You'll be caring for Clara Reynolds today," she explained. "Room 412. She's 86, recovering from a heart attack. Stable, but needs regular monitoring and assistance." Leona nodded, flipping through the file as she walked towards Clara's room. According to the notes, Clara was making steady progress but still required careful attention. As she approached room 412, Leona felt a growing sense of responsibility. This woman's well-being was in her hands, and she was determined to provide the best care possible. Leona knocked gently on the door before entering Clara's room. The sight that greeted her made her heart ache with sympathy. Clara Reynolds was a frail black woman, her thin frame nearly swallowed up by the hospital bed. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to push herself up to a sitting position. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said warmly, moving to Clara's bedside. "I'm Leona, and I'll be your nurse for the weekend. How are you feeling today?" Clara's face lit up with a grateful smile, though Leona could see the weariness in her eyes. "Oh, bless you, dear," Clara said, her voice soft and slightly raspy. "I'm doing all right, I suppose, just tired of being cooped up in this bed." As Leona began her initial assessment, checking Clara's vitals and making notes in her chart, she was struck by how lonely the elderly woman seemed. Clara asked Leona questions about herself, seeming genuinely interested in getting to know her nurse. It was clear that she craved human interaction and kindness. "You're so gentle, dear," Clara commented, as Leona helped her take her morning medication. "Some of the other nurses, they're in such a rush, but you take your time. I appreciate that." Leona felt a lump form in her throat. She wondered how often Clara received visitors, how much genuine care and attention she got in her daily life. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Reynolds," she replied. "I want to make sure you're comfortable and well taken care of." As she went about her duties, wiping Clara's face and hands, adjusting her pillows and helping her eat breakfast, Leona found herself growing fond of the elderly woman. Clara's gratitude for even the smallest kindnesses was touching, and her attempts at conversation, despite her obvious fatigue, spoke of a deep loneliness. "I'll be back to check on you later, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona promised as she prepared to leave the room. "Is there anything else you need before I go?" Clara shook her head, still smiling. "No, dear, you've been so kind already, thank you." As Leona left the room, she felt a mix of emotions. She was glad to have brightened Clara's morning, but saddened by the thought of the hardships this woman must have faced in her long life. She made a mental note to spend a little extra time with Clara during her shifts, knowing that sometimes a friendly face and a listening ear could be as healing as any medicine. The morning passed in a blur of activity for Leona. She checked on her other patients, administered medications, changed dressings, and coordinated with doctors on treatment plans. Despite the hectic pace, her thoughts kept drifting back to Clara, wondering how the elderly woman was faring. As Leona was updating a patient's chart at the nurse's station, a sharp beeping sound cut through the ambient noise of the hospital. Her head snapped up, eyes immediately going to the board that displayed patient room alerts. Clara's room number was flashing red. Without hesitation, Leona dropped what she was doing and rushed down the hallway. Her heart raced as she approached room 412, her mind cycling through possible scenarios. Had Clara fallen? Was she having chest pains? Or was it something more benign, like a call for assistance to use the restroom? Leona pushed open the door, ready to spring into action, but what greeted her was not what she expected at all. The first thing that hit her was the smell, a sharp, acrid odor that made her nose wrinkle involuntarily. As her eyes adjusted to the dimmer light of the room, she saw Clara lying in bed, looking distressed. The white sheets and Clara's hospital gown were stained with a yellowish liquid. Leona's gaze fell on a blue hospital urine bottle, tipped over on the bed next to Clara. The pieces started to come together in Leona's mind, but something still felt off about the situation. "Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said gently, approaching the bed. "What happened? Are you all right?" Clara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were downcast and she seemed to be struggling to find words. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity to Leona, who was trying to make sense of the scene before her. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor did this." Leona blinked, sure she must have misheard. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. Did you say the doctor? Did he accidentally spill the bottle?" Clara nodded slowly but didn't offer any further explanation. The look in her eyes, a mixture of shame, fear, and something else Leona couldn't quite place, sent a chill down the nurse's spine. Something wasn't right here, but Leona couldn't quite put her finger on what. "I'm so sorry this happened, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring despite her growing unease. "Let's get you cleaned up, shall we? I'll change the sheets and help you into some fresh clothes." As Leona went about cleaning up the mess and helping Clara change, her mind was racing. Why would a doctor be handling a urine bottle in the first place? That was typically a nurse's job. And if it had been an accident, why hadn't the doctor called for assistance to clean it up? Why leave Clara sitting in soiled sheets? Clara remained unusually quiet throughout the process, her earlier warmth replaced by a distant sadness. Leona tried to engage her in conversation, but Clara responded only with short, non-committal answers. Before leaving the room, Leona paused at the door. "Mrs. Reynolds, are you sure you're all right? Is there anything else you want to tell me about what happened?" Clara looked up, meeting Leona's eyes for a brief moment before looking away again. "No, dear, thank you for your help." As Leona left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a simple accident. The image of Clara, sitting in those soiled clothes with that look of quiet despair, haunted her. She resolved to keep a closer eye on Clara's room and to try to find out more about what had really happened. When midday approached, she made her way to the hospital cafeteria, hoping that a short break might help clear her head and allow her to approach the situation with fresh eyes. As Leona sat in the hospital cafeteria, picking at her salad, she found it impossible to focus on anything but the incident in Clara's room. The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would a doctor be handling a urine bottle? And if it truly had been an accident, why hadn't he called for help to clean it up? The image of Clara sitting in those soiled clothes with that look of quiet despair kept flashing through Leona's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister might be at play. But what could it be? And more importantly, what should she do about it? Leona glanced around the cafeteria, her eyes landing on a fellow nurse she recognized from previous shifts. Making a split-second decision, she stood up and approached the other woman's table. "Excuse me," Leona said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I was wondering if you could help me with something. Do you know which doctor is in charge of Clara Reynolds in cardiology?" The other nurse looked up from her lunch, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "I'm sorry, I don't," she replied. "I'm assigned to surgery today, and I haven't been in this part of the hospital for a while. You might want to check with the head nurse. They should have the full list." Leona thanked her and apologized for the interruption. As she walked away, she felt a mix of disappointment and determination. She needed answers, and it seemed the head nurse's office was her best bet. The walk to the head nurse's office felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the gravity of what Leona was considering. Was she overreacting? Maybe it had just been an unfortunate accident, and she was reading too much into Clara's reaction, but something in her gut told her that wasn't the case. Leona knocked on the door of the head nurse's office, her heart pounding. When she heard a muffled, "Come in," she took a deep breath and entered. The head nurse looked up from her desk, her expression neutral. "Can I help you?" Leona swallowed hard, then spoke. "I was checking my notes for Clara Reynolds and I don't see the doctor assigned to her. I need to ask about something related to her care." To Leona's surprise, the head nurse didn't question her further. Instead, she simply nodded and pulled out a thick folder from a drawer in her desk. "Here's the full file," she said, handing it to Leona. "Take your time." Grateful for the unexpected cooperation, Leona thanked her and moved to a quiet corner of the office. She opened the file with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the pages for the information she needed. There, in black and white, was the name of Clara's attending physician, Dr. Sebastian Pierce. Leona's stomach tightened. She had heard of him. He was one of the hospital's most senior and influential doctors. The implications of this discovery made her head spin. As Leona continued to read through the file, searching for any other relevant information, she suddenly realized how much time had passed. Her lunch break was almost over, and she had patients waiting for her, patients who were counting on her to provide care and comfort. With a heavy sigh, Leona closed the file and returned it to the head nurse. As she left the office, she tried to push her suspicions to the back of her mind. She had a job to do, and she couldn't let herself get distracted by what might just be her imagination running wild. Still, as she walked back to her assigned floor, Leona made a mental note to keep an eye out for Dr. Pierce. If she crossed paths with him later, she resolved to subtly ask about the situation with Clara. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Maybe he had been in a rush or had to attend to a more critical patient. As Leona made her way back to her workstation, her mind was still churning with thoughts about Clara and Dr. Pierce. She stepped into an empty elevator, grateful for a moment of solitude to collect her thoughts. Just as the doors were about to close, a hand shot out to stop them, and Dr. Sebastian Pierce himself stepped in. Leona's heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. He looked slightly different from the mental image she had formed, perhaps more tired, with subtle lines of stress etched around his eyes. But there was no mistaking the name on his ID badge. Dr. Pierce nodded politely to Leona as he entered the elevator. To her surprise, he broke the silence with a friendly smile. "How's your day going?" he asked casually. adjusting well to our fast-paced environment. Leona, caught off guard by his approachability, found herself relaxing slightly. "It's challenging," she admitted with a small smile, "but I'm managing. Thank you for asking, Dr. Pierce." As the elevator ascended, Leona saw an opportunity to address her lingering concerns. Taking a deep breath, she decided to broach the subject. "Dr. Pierce, I actually wanted to ask you about something. I'm caring for Clara Reynolds, and there was an incident earlier with a urine bottle." The change in Dr. Pierce's demeanor was immediate and startling. His friendly expression hardened, and he cut Leona off mid-sentence. "Ah, yes," he said dismissively. "Mrs. Reynolds probably dropped the bottle herself and then made up a story out of embarrassment. You know how elderly patients can be sometimes." Leona felt a chill run down her spine at his tone. "But, sir," she persisted, "Mrs. Reynolds specifically said—" "I didn't do it," Dr. Pierce interrupted, his voice sharp and his eyes narrowing. "If the patient said anything else, she's just making excuses for an accident she caused herself. I'm far too busy to be concerned with such trivial issues." The elevator reached their floor, and Dr. Pierce stepped out without waiting for Leona's response, leaving her stunned and more confused than ever. As she watched him stride away down the corridor, Leona felt her earlier suspicions flooding back with renewed force. Leona and Dr. Pierce walked down the hallway together in tense silence, the doctor's abrupt end to their elevator conversation hanging heavily in the air. Leona's mind raced, torn between her instinct to press further and her fear of overstepping professional boundaries. Suddenly, Dr. Pierce stopped walking and turned to face her. His expression was cold, his eyes piercing as he looked down at her. When he spoke, his voice was low and firm, carrying an unmistakable note of warning. "Listen, nurse," he began, emphasizing her title in a way that made it sound almost derogatory. "I know you're just a temporary hire here to help out, but let me be very clear, you need to focus on your own work and leave matters concerning my patients to me. I am the doctor here, not you." Leona felt her face flush with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Pierce cut her off, stepping closer. His voice dropped even lower, taking on a menacing edge that made Leona's skin crawl. "It's highly unprofessional for a nurse to question a doctor's actions or decisions," he continued. "If you overstep like this again, I'll make sure the head nurse hears about it. And trust me, you might find it difficult to work here, or anywhere else. In the future. Do I make myself clear?" Without waiting for a response, Dr. Pierce turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Leona standing alone in the hallway, stunned and shaken. As the sound of Dr. Pierce's footsteps faded, Leona felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Part of her was furious at his condescending attitude and thinly veiled threats, but another part, the part that had worked so hard to become a nurse, that cherished her ability to help others, was filled with self-doubt. Had she overstepped by questioning Dr. Pierce? After all, he was the doctor, with years more experience and training than she had. Maybe she had misread the situation entirely. The thought of potentially jeopardizing her career over what might be a simple misunderstanding made her stomach churn. Leona leaned against the wall, closing her eyes and taking a few deep breaths to steady herself. She thought about Clara, alone in her room, possibly at the mercy of a doctor who seemed to care little for her well-being. But then she thought about all the other patients who depended on her, and how she couldn't help any of them if she lost her job. As the afternoon wore on, Leona found herself constantly checking the time, anticipating her next visit to Clara's room. When it was finally time to administer Clara's next round of medication, Leona felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She made her way to the medicine room, methodically collecting the prescribed medications for Clara. As she walked towards room 412, Leona's mind was still preoccupied with her earlier confrontation with Dr. Pierce. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the fact that Clara's door was slightly ajar. Leona slowed her steps as she approached, suddenly aware of voices coming from inside the room. She recognized Dr. Pierce's voice immediately, and her first instinct was to turn around and come back later, not wanting to interrupt a conversation between doctor and patient. But something in Dr. Pierce's tone made her pause. Gone was the professional demeanor he usually maintained around patients. Instead, his voice was harsh and condescending, dripping with disdain. Leona's heart began to race as she edged closer to the door, straining to hear what was being said. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Your kind is a burden to this country," Dr. Pierce was saying, his voice low but clear. "You're taking up space in my hospital, wasting resources that could be used on patients who actually matter." Leona's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple personality clash. This was overt racism and abuse. She stood frozen outside the door, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to burst into the room immediately and confront Dr. Pierce. But another part, the part that remembered his earlier threats, held her back. What if she lost her job? What if no one believed her? As Leona grappled with her decision, she heard a loud bang from inside the room. The sound jolted her out of her paralysis. Without thinking, she pushed the door open and rushed inside. The scene that greeted her was one of chaos. Clara was cowering in her bed, her face pale and her hands trembling. The lunch tray Leona had brought earlier was overturned, food scattered across the bed and floor. The source of the bang became clear as Leona spotted a shattered plate on the ground. Dr. Pierce stood by the bedside, momentarily shocked by Leona's sudden entrance. But he quickly regained his composure, his face settling into a mask of professional concern. "Ah, nurse," he said, his voice suddenly calm and authoritative. "Clara here had a bit of an accident with her lunch. Could you clean this up, please?" Leona stood rooted to the spot, her eyes darting between Clara's terrified face and Dr. Pierce's cool demeanor. In that moment, she knew she had a choice to make, one that could change everything. Leona's mind raced as she took in the scene before her. Clara's frightened expression, the scattered food, Dr. Pierce's sudden shift to a professional demeanor. It all painted a clear picture of what had truly transpired. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Dr. Pierce had been responsible for the earlier urine incident as well. Everything fell into place with sickening clarity. Despite the churning in her stomach, Leona forced herself to remain outwardly calm. She nodded at Dr. Pierce, not trusting herself to speak without revealing her anger and disgust. As she moved to start cleaning up the mess, she kept a watchful eye on both Clara and the doctor. Dr. Pierce, seemingly satisfied that his authority wasn't being questioned, turned his attention back to Clara. With clinical detachment, he began drawing a blood sample from the terrified woman. Clara's eyes flickered towards Leona, silently pleading for help. Leona's heart ached as she watched Clara endure the procedure, knowing the fear and humiliation the elderly woman must be feeling. She wanted nothing more than to intervene, to protect Clara from this man who was abusing his position of power. As she cleaned, Leona's mind whirred with possibilities. Should she confront Dr. Pierce directly, report him to hospital administration, call the police? Each option carried risks, both for herself and for Clara. She needed to be smart about this, to ensure that justice would be served without putting Clara in further danger. Finally, Dr. Pierce finished his task. He gathered his things and left the room without another word, leaving behind a palpable tension in the air. As soon as the door closed behind him, Leona rushed to Clara's side. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said softly, taking the older woman's hand. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" Clara's eyes welled up with tears, but she shook her head. Not physically," she whispered. "But his words, the way he looks at me, like I'm nothing." Leona felt a surge of protective anger. "Mrs. Reynolds, what Dr. Pierce is doing is wrong. We need to report him." Fear flashed across Clara's face. No, she said, her voice trembling. "He's a doctor. Who would believe me over him? I don't want to cause trouble." "I believe you," Leona said firmly, "and I saw what happened. We can't let him keep treating you or anyone else this way." Leona's mind was made up. She couldn't stand by and allow Dr. Pierce to continue abusing Clara or any other patient. With a deep breath to steady her nerves, she left Clara's room and headed down the hallway, determined to confront the doctor directly. She found Dr. Pierce at the nurse's station, casually flipping through a patient chart as if nothing had happened. The sight of him acting so nonchalant after what she had witnessed made Leona's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain outwardly calm. "Dr. Pierce," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I need to speak with you about Mrs. Reynolds." The doctor looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and condescension. "What is it now, nurse? I thought I made myself clear earlier." Leona stood her ground, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "I overheard your conversation with Mrs. Reynolds, Dr. Pierce. What you said to her was completely unacceptable. It was racist, abusive, and a violation of everything we're supposed to stand for as healthcare professionals." Dr. Pierce's face darkened, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You're making some very serious accusations, nurse. I suggest you think very carefully about what you're saying and the consequences it might have for your career." "I'm not making accusations," Leona replied, her voice growing stronger. "I'm stating facts. I saw how you treated Mrs. Reynolds, and I heard what you said to her. It's elder abuse, plain and simple, and I won't stand for it." The doctor's facade of professional detachment cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed, leaning in close. "That woman is taking up a bed that could be used for someone who actually contributes to society. I'm doing my job, prioritizing resources for those who deserve them." Leona felt a chill run down her spine at the casual cruelty in his words, but she didn't back down. "That's not your decision to make, Dr. Pierce. Every patient deserves equal care and respect, regardless of their age, race, or social status. What you're doing isn't just unethical, it's illegal." Dr. Pierce's face contorted with rage. "You're nothing but a temporary nurse," he spat. "Who do you think they'll believe? Me, a respected doctor with years of experience, or you? You're throwing away your career over some worthless old woman." "Mrs. Reynolds is not worthless," Leona said, her voice shaking with anger. "And I'm not throwing away anything. I'm doing my job, protecting my patient. I've documented everything I've seen and heard, Dr. Pierce. This stops now." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across the doctor's face, but it was quickly replaced by a sneer. "Do what you think you have to do, nurse," he said dismissively. "But remember, I warned you about the consequences." As Dr. Pierce turned and walked away, Leona felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Fear, anger, and a grim determination. She knew she had just made a powerful enemy, one who could potentially destroy her career. But she also knew with absolute certainty that she had done the right thing. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Leona turned back towards Clara's room. She had set events in motion that couldn't be undone. Now she had to make sure Clara was safe and figure out her next steps. Leona re-entered Clara's room, her mind racing from the confrontation with Dr. Pierce. The elderly woman looked up at her, concern etched across her face. "Clara," Leona said gently, sitting down beside the bed, "I need to know something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did Dr. Pierce really spill that urine bottle on you earlier?" Clara's eyes widened and she hesitated for a moment. Her hands trembled as she clutched the bedsheet. Finally, she slowly nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He did. And it wasn't the first time he's done something like that." Leona felt a mixture of anger and vindication wash over her. Her suspicions had been correct. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an accident. It was a pattern of abuse. "Clara, what Dr. Pierce is doing is wrong," Leona said firmly, taking the older woman's hand in hers. "It's abusive and it's discriminatory. We need to report this." Clara hesitated, clearly torn between her fear and the desire for justice. Leona could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. "You don't have to decide right now," Leona reassured her, "but I want you to know that you're not alone in this. I'm here to help you and I won't let him hurt you again." After a moment of internal struggle, Leona made a decision. She reached for her work phone, her hand trembling slightly. "What are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice tight with worry. Leona met Clara's eyes with determination. "I'm calling for justice, Clara. This isn't right, and you deserve better." She dialed 911, her heart pounding in her chest. As Leona waited for the operator to answer, she saw Dr. Pierce walk past the room. He must have overheard her conversation with Clara, because he entered the room, his expression full of smug amusement. "Calling the police, really?" His voice was laced with sarcasm. "You honestly believe they'll listen to a nurse over me? I'm a doctor. You don't understand how things work here." Leona stood her ground, not backing down as Dr. Pierce gave her one last condescending smirk and walked out, confident that his position would protect him from any consequences. As the 911 operator answered, Leona took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I need to report a case of elder abuse and racial discrimination at Valora Medical Institute. My name is Leona Dawson and I'm a nurse here. One of our doctors has been verbally abusing and discriminating against an elderly patient." Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived at Valora Medical Institute. Leona met them at the hospital's reception, feeling nervous but resolute. She led them to Clara's room, where the elderly woman was still shaken by the earlier events. The officers introduced themselves as they entered the room. "I'm Officer Johnson, and this is my partner, Officer Rodriguez," the taller of the two said. His voice was calm and professional, but Leona could see the concern in his eyes as he took in Clara's frightened demeanor. "Can you tell us more about what's been happening here?" Officer Rodriguez asked, her voice gentle as she addressed both Leona and Clara. Leona took a deep breath and began to recount the incidents in detail. She explained how Dr. Pierce had spilled the urine bottle earlier, verbally abused Clara, and caused the mess in her room. As she spoke, she could see the officer's expressions growing more serious. He said I was taking up space," Clara added softly, her voice trembling, "that I didn't deserve to be here." Officer Johnson nodded gravely, jotting down notes. "Mrs. Reynolds, has this happened before?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "many times. But I was too afraid to say anything." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces hardening with resolve. "We take allegations of elder abuse and discrimination very seriously," Officer Rodriguez said. "Can you tell us more about Dr. Pierce's behavior?" Leona described how she had overheard the racist remarks, how Dr. Pierce had mocked Clara when he thought no one was listening. She explained the pattern of behavior she had observed, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways Dr. Pierce had made Clara feel unwelcome and unworthy of care. As Leona spoke, she could see Clara becoming more animated, as if drawing strength from finally having her experiences acknowledged and believed. The elderly woman began to add her own details, describing incidents that Leona hadn't been aware of. The officers listened intently, asking clarifying questions and taking detailed notes. Their professional demeanor was reassuring, and Leona felt a sense of relief washing over her. They were taking this seriously. They believed them. "We're going to need to speak with Dr. Pierce," Officer Johnson said finally. "Is he still in the hospital?" As if on cue, there was a commotion in the hallway. Leona turned to see Dr. Pierce striding towards the room, his face a mask of indignation. Dr. Pierce burst into the room, his eyes blazing with anger. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, looking from the officers to Leona and then to Clara. "I'm in the middle of important work, and I'm being summoned like some common criminal?" Officer Johnson stepped forward, his stance calm but authoritative. "Dr. Pierce, we're here investigating allegations of elder abuse and racial discrimination. We need to ask you some questions about your interactions with Mrs. Reynolds." For a moment, Dr. Pierce looked taken aback, but then, to everyone's shock, a smug smile spread across his face. "Oh, is that all?" he said, chuckling as if he'd just heard a mildly amusing joke. "I suppose the nurse here has been filling your heads with nonsense." Leona felt her blood boil at his dismissive attitude, but she held her tongue, letting the officers handle the situation. Officer Rodriguez spoke up, her voice stern. "Dr. Pierce, these are very serious allegations. We need you to answer our questions truthfully." What followed was a display of arrogance that left everyone in the room stunned. Instead of denying the accusations or offering explanations, Dr. Pierce seemed to revel in confirming them. "Of course I said those things, and yes, I did those things," he declared, gesturing towards Clara. "Look at her. She's taking up a bed that could be used for someone who actually contributes to society. I'm just being efficient with our resources." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Leona glanced at Clara, who had shrunk back in her bed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Officer Johnson's voice was tight with controlled anger when he spoke. "Dr. Pierce, are you admitting to verbally abusing Mrs. Reynolds and discriminating against her based on her race and age?" Dr. Pierce rolled his eyes. "If that's what you want to call it, I call it doing my job. This hospital doesn't have unlimited resources, and it's my responsibility to ensure they're used effectively." Leona couldn't contain herself any longer. "No, Dr. Pierce," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is not how things work. This is abuse, plain and simple, and it ends now." Dr. Pierce looked at her, his expression a mixture of amusement and disdain. "You really don't understand how the world works, do you, nurse? People like me don't face consequences. We're too important, too well connected." As Dr. Pierce finished his arrogant speech, Officer Johnson stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click as he opened them seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. "Dr. Sebastian Pierce," he said, his voice firm and official, "you're under arrest for elder abuse and violation of civil rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" The smug smile finally fell from Dr. Pierce's face as the reality of the situation sank in. His eyes widened in disbelief as Officer Johnson began to secure the handcuffs around his wrists. "This is ridiculous," Dr. Pierce sputtered, his composure crumbling. "You can't arrest me. Do you have any idea who I am?" Officer Rodriguez stepped in, her voice calm but brooking no argument. "Your position doesn't put you above the law, Dr. Pierce. You've admitted to abusive and discriminatory behavior. We're taking you into custody." As the officers began to lead him out of the room, Dr. Pierce's demeanor changed dramatically. The arrogance gave way to panic, and he began to struggle against the handcuffs. "You can't do this," he shouted, his face reddening with rage and fear. "I'll have all your jobs for this. I have connections. I have influence." His eyes locked with Leona's as he was being led out. The look he gave her was one of pure hatred, promising retribution. But Leona stood tall, meeting his gaze without flinching. She had done what was right, and no amount of threats could make her regret that decision. The commotion drew attention from the hospital staff. As Dr. Pierce was escorted down the hallway, nurses, doctors, and patients stopped to stare. Many looked shocked, but Leona noticed more than a few expressions of relief on the faces of the staff. Dr. Pierce continued to protest as he was led towards the exit, but his words fell on deaf ears. The staff members he had bullied and intimidated for so long simply watched in silence as he was led away, many of them exchanging glances of vindication. As Dr. Pierce disappeared from view, Leona felt a wave of relief wash over her. She turned back to Clara's room, where the elderly woman sat in her bed, looking shell-shocked but somehow stronger. "It's over, Clara," Leona said softly, moving to sit beside her. "He can't hurt you anymore." Clara reached out and grasped Leona's hand, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of fear or sadness. For the first time since Leona had met her, Clara's eyes shone with hope. As the initial shock of Dr. Pierce's arrest began to wear off, the full emotional weight of the day's events finally hit Clara. The elderly woman, who had been so strong and composed throughout the ordeal, suddenly broke down. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she began to sob, her thin frame shaking with the force of her emotions. "I can't believe it's over," she said between gasps. "All this time, I thought no one would ever believe me, that I'd have to endure his cruelty forever." Leona immediately moved closer, wrapping her arms around Clara in a gentle embrace. "It's okay, Clara," she soothed. "Let it all out. You're safe now. It's over." As Clara cried, she began to share more about her life experiences. "You know, dear," she said, her voice trembling, "I've faced racism and discrimination my whole life, but nothing as extreme as this, to be treated like I was worthless, like my life didn't matter, and in a hospital of all places, a place where I should have felt safe and cared for." Leona felt her own eyes welling up with tears as she listened to Clara's story. The injustice of it all, the years of silent suffering this kind woman had endured, broke her heart. As Clara's sobs began to subside, Leona gently wiped the tears from her face with a tissue. "You know," Leona said softly, "you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. It takes incredible strength to endure what you did, and even more to speak up about it." Clara managed a weak smile through her tears. "I don't feel very brave," she admitted. "I was so scared for so long. If it wasn't for you, I might never have found the courage to say anything." Leona shook her head. "You had the courage all along, Clara. I just helped you find it." She paused, then added, "And you've helped me find mine too. Standing up to Dr. Pierce wasn't easy, but seeing your strength gave me the push I needed to do what was right." As Clara's emotions settled, Leona helped her get more comfortable in bed. She adjusted Clara's pillows and poured her a glass of water, her movements gentle and caring. "Leona, dear," Clara said, her voice hoarse from crying, "what happens now? Will I have to testify against Dr. Pierce? I don't know if I can face him again." Leona sat on the edge of the bed, taking Clara's hand in hers. "I won't lie to you, Clara. There might be a trial and you might be asked to testify, but you won't have to go through any of it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way if you want me to be." Clara's eyes welled up with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "You would do that for me?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Of course I would," Leona said without hesitation. "In fact, I'm going to request from my employer to be assigned more shifts here at Valora, specifically to continue caring for you as long as you're hospitalized. I want to make sure you're safe and well cared for." Clara squeezed Leona's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for believing me, for standing up for me when no one else would." Leona felt tears prick at her own eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Clara. This is what being a nurse is all about. Protecting our patients, advocating for them no matter what." As the evening wore on, Leona stayed by Clara's side even after her shift had officially ended. They talked more about Clara's life, about the hardships she had faced, and the joys she had experienced. Leona shared stories from her own life too, and as they talked, a deep bond began to form between the two women. Before Leona finally left for the night, she and Clara exchanged contact information. "If you need anything, day or night, you call me," Leona insisted. "And Clara, if you decide to press charges against Dr. Pierce, I want you to know that I'll support you through the entire process. We're in this together now." Clara nodded, a look of determination replacing the fear in her eyes. I think I want to press charges," she said. "Not just for me, but for anyone else who might have suffered because of him. We need to make sure he can never do this to anyone else." Leona felt a surge of pride at Clara's words. "That's incredibly brave of you, Clara. And you're right. This isn't just about you or me anymore. It's about making sure this kind of abuse and discrimination doesn't happen to anyone else." As Leona prepared to leave, she made one last promise to Clara. "I'm going to spread the word about what happened here," she said. "I'll make sure everyone in this hospital knows what Dr. Pierce did, and I'll do everything I can to ensure he never works in healthcare again. You have my word on that." Clara's eyes shone with gratitude and newfound hope. "Thank you, Leona." for everything. As Leona prepared to leave, she made one last promise to Clara. She vowed to spread the word about what had happened, ensuring that everyone in the hospital would know about Dr. Pierce's actions. Leona committed to doing everything in her power to prevent him from ever working in healthcare again. Her words were filled with determination and sincerity. Clara's eyes shone with gratitude and newfound hope as she listened to Leona's promise. The elderly woman's expression conveyed more than words could express, a mix of relief, thankfulness, and admiration for the young nurse who had become her champion. As Leona finally left Clara's room that night, she was overwhelmed by a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The day had been one of the most challenging of her career, but also one of the most rewarding. She had stood up for what was right, had given a voice to someone who had been silenced for too long, and in doing so, had truly embodied the principles that had led her to become a nurse in the first place.